Great. So my name is Rita Cito with the Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Planning Commission. I'm focused on transportation planning here at the Regional Commission, but also do a lot of grants. So thank you all for being able to join us today. We're going to talk about how towns can prepare for grant applications in the next, 45 minutes or so. Um, Let me kind of move forward on my, oops, perfect. So here's just a really quick overview of some of the things that we are going to go over. I'm not going to be discussing every single grant that is out there in great detail, but I think from a 10,000 level, we will talk about how towns can prepare themselves for any kind of grants and what are some of the key aspects that towns can prepare themselves so that they can be successful and execute a grant to the final implementation. So um, first of all, we all kind of know grants. We get emails about different grants pretty much every single day now. We definitely hear a lot from our communities, especially after town meeting, about what grants are out there, what grants am I missing, can we apply for all grants? Um, so this is kind of just a quick little screenshot of, what are grants exactly? As we know, grants are a way to fund some of the projects that towns have in kind of I want to say, reduced financial capacity or kind of offset some of that budget cost. As we all know, different funders have different requirements for grants. Some are fairly easy to accomplish. Some have a laundry list that can be kind of onerous. Um, and also viewing grants, they're not necessarily a automatic check that's going to be like, yeah, we're going to apply for a grant and it's going to cover, the typical 80% of a project cost and we call it good and so be it. Most likely, by the time you apply for a grant and when grants actually occur, um, the costs will have probably increased over the period of when you have actually applied for it for when it actually gets implemented. So, we try our best when we apply for grants to get the best information or the best costs that we have so that we can present that budget to the grant funders. But sometimes, things happen like COVID, or perhaps, inflation, natural inflation, but also extreme inflation that we've seen in the last few years. And that's kind of beyond anybody's control. So we kind of take it as it is. Um, Another aspect that we should consider for grants is grants are great, but also, you should consider that towns need to have some sort of commitment when you get a grant. There will be some extra admin time that the town needs to devote to that particular grant. Um, it may fund unique projects that normally are not funded. Um, or perhaps may fund typical things like sidewalks. However, it may not necessarily address sort of the long-term maintenance costs, and that's not really built into the initial project when you build them. So another thing that we've heard a lot is, from towns, hey, what grants am I missing? Let's apply for all of them. And, you know, it can be a lot for a town to manage all of these grants. I think it depends on your town capacity as well as your budgeting aspect. We feel like instead of trying to think of a project that could fit in a particular grant eligibility, that a more strategic approach for a town would be to kind of look at what are your town's, project priorities, whether it's from, from a transportation aspect, town facility aspect, town services aspect, um, what are kind of the top priorities of a town to kind of focus their efforts on, rather than from like a shotgun approach and just let's throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, because that's probably, you know, not a good approach for towns. We understand town staff and town boards are pretty burnt out. Um, and so they can only handle so much. So we feel like the best approach for towns would be to come up with either, a capital plan, or, prioritizing what, um, projects or town infrastructure that is really in need of, repairs or reconstruction, and kind of go from there. So this is another one. Why are you applying for grants? Because you want to offset some of the costs for those repairs, um, in your town. I kind of have this interesting pyramid, um, and it might be kind of reflective of what's in your town budget. Transportation is probably the biggest chunk of your budget, followed by town facilities, and then if your town has, services. Um, so kind of that might be one of those things where you can kind of look at your town project priorities and say, yeah, we want to focus mostly on transportation, which is going to be, your annual grants, the ones that occur fairly regularly. And like we're going to strategically tackle these on a yearly basis or like every other year, depending on our budget capacity. Town facilities, town offices, libraries, um, those things that might need more in-depth architecture and design. Those obviously won't have projects or scopes that you would need to do every year. Those are probably once in a, 5 or 10 years type of thing. And then town services, of course. Um, and I do would like to point out that there has been a lot of interest of towns for town garages. There, at least to my knowledge, there are currently no grants out there to fund town garages. It's been mostly for, towns have bonded for it, which is essentially how they've gotten new town garages. But obviously, if we hear anything, we will let towns know of that funding. So key steps. What are some of the things that towns should consider even before applying for grants? Um, some of these things might be really basic, but I think these are some key foundation aspects that towns should have kind of moving forward. First one is always an interesting one. SAM.gov registration. Um, if you don't know, all towns should have a unique entity identifier, and they should, and I don't know if you can see this, I kind of clicked onto the sam.gov website here. Each town should have a account so that the federal government can kind of track, all the grant projects and things like that you have acquired. And you have to renew it every year. When there has been town staff turnover, perhaps new employees may not be aware of this, and that has lapsed. So it kind of will impact future grants as well as existing grants, maybe for reimbursement. So it'll be very important to make sure your town sam.gov registration is active and current. So another aspect is looking at, we want to grant for this. This is the type of project we want. Okay, great. Are you guys ready to go to construction? Do you need some planning efforts? Do you need like a scoping study? Do you need an engineering study? Do you need an architecture to kind of figure out the design as well as figuring out what the final construction cost will be? Um, which also leads to the next piece, right? Engineering, architecture services. They will know exactly, what permits you will eventually need, what that cost will be, um, and kind of help you develop that guideline. Um, Historic preservation. Oh, let's see. Sorry, Mara. Who has responsibility to renew the sam.gov? Um, well, that would depend on who perhaps initially created the account. So sometimes it's the town clerk, it might be the town treasurer, sometimes it might be whoever was the designated person, perhaps on the select board. Um, it actually can vary from the town, but the most important piece is, um, if there is staff turnover, who has the original, account and password for that. So hopefully somebody can designate that in the town of, renewing the sam.gov. Could be either the town clerk or the treasurer might be kind of the typical responsibility for that. So as we kind of continue on for elements for towns for preparation, um, most transportation related construction projects, whether it's paving, culvert, you probably just more need like engineering design services and permits. If you're dealing with buildings, may need some architectural services. If it's an historic building, you may trigger historic preservation and will need to coordinate with, the state historic preservation officer for comments, which may also restrict or guide what you can and cannot do to an existing building. Let's see. So I'm actually going to I'm going to address the chat stuff after the conversation so we can kind of keep going here. And then we'll open it up for some Q&A discussion. So another piece, a big piece of grant applications is the budget, right? Do you know how much you're going to ask for? A lot of the grant tours would like some sort of justification on the budget, as well as, most of them will be saying that, yep, the town agrees to, we understand that the grant will only cover this percentage of the budget or the project cost, and the town will be understands that they will cover any overages for this project that the full grant may not cover. And people and and towns will be like, yep, we understand, we sign off. But ultimately we know when when it comes to the actual design and construction and the final cost, there may be some, differences of like, oh, this has really increased a lot in the budget or the funding. Where can we get some additional funds, et cetera, et cetera. So we can talk about that a little bit later as well. Other projects, do you need the town approval? Most likely. Do you need a town vote? That also depends how big the project is. Are you going to go for a bond vote that requires a town vote? So those are some of the things that the town can kind of consider. Also budget wise, if you know that the town is going to pursue a grant that requires at least this much match beforehand, perhaps in the budget, you should start setting aside, $30,000, $50,000 for that match so that, we understand, oh, this project is going to cost the town at least $100,000 in match. You can start setting aside $50,000 each year leading up to perhaps the construction year. Adopted town plan. Do all grants require an adopted town plan? Not necessarily. It depends on the grant. Um, for transportation grants through VTrans, it doesn't necessarily say they have an adopted town plan. However, usually in the narrative, they will ask, how does this project kind of support what the town's goals are? And usually, um, in the narrative, they would draw either from the town plan or a previous scoping study to say, yep, this project is in line with what the town's future vision is. Um, Grants through the Agency of Community Development and Commerce. Yeah, they will say, do you have an approved town plan? And so it's very direct that way. Some other ones, not so much, but so yeah, the question of adopt a town plan kind of comes into play sometimes. All right. So the other piece, budget development. Well, let me see. Yep. Budget development, right? This is a lot of text and I'll kind of go through it. Like we said, sometimes developing a budget is probably the hardest part of a grant application. And also depends on your project scope. So from a transportation viewpoint, this text is actually taken from the VTrans Bike Ped grant application. It kind of addresses, project administration, engineering, municipal project management costs, any right-of-way costs, construction, inspection oversight. Obviously, this is more for a larger project that requires federal funds. That is a little bit, bigger than just like a state one. But this is something to kind of consider in perhaps all your potential construction projects. Um, they look at, yeah, project management. Um, Most towns seem to default to town staff. They may or may not have the capacity or the knowledge to kind of, navigate a particular grant program. Um, and so sometimes it may be beneficial to have a municipal project manager that can help the town kind of keep this project moving forward. Right-of-way costs are also very important. If you are outside of the right-of-way, construction costs, that will be important. Developed from a design engineer when they have some engineering estimates, and also for construction inspection oversight. And that would be if a project is over $250,000 in using federal funds, the grantor, and I'm going to just default and say VTrans, would require that a separate firm be hired to do construction inspection and just making sure that the contractor is installing and constructing whatever is on the design plans. So there's a lot of information, but I think this is kind of what I kind of use as a spreadsheet estimate, right? And you can use this too to kind of do a general budget estimate when you're kind of developing it, right? So design engineering, you've got construction costs, contingency, right-of-way, construction inspection. I kind of developed this for a town for a large bike ped construction grant. There's a lot of numbers in here, but I think the biggest piece for this is the cell that's highlighted in yellow. That'll be kind of your base construction cost. And then everything else in that column is based on formula. So we know from your construction costs and include including contingency, your design and engineering should be roughly about 20% of that construction cost. Construction inspection engineering should be about 15%. Municipal project management should be around 10% of the entire project. And not to mention, as we talked about, for a large project, when you're applying for, um, that might be, 4 years down the line from when you get awarded to final construction. So you may also want to include building in inflation for each year until you actually get to construction. And I know that, 4% inflation per year is a pretty decent number to use, to kind of make sure that by the time you apply for a grant, that the costs will naturally increase over the years. And so this hopefully will help by the time you get to actual construction year. Um, you'll be like, well, I'm 100 grand off budget now because it's been 4 years and the costs have skyrocketed, and now the town has to cover an extra 100,000 or something like that, to get the project done. So, if you're interested, I have this, or you can create this spreadsheet and just kind of use it for a formula to kind of play around with numbers. Um, and then, as a summary, these are kind of the percentages for your budget development. Obviously, this version is more for like a fully federal construction project. Um, the more simpler ones won't have a lot of these items because they probably won't be required based on your grantor. So post award. So you've submitted a grant application, great, and it gets awarded. Fantastic. A lot of towns, or perhaps not a lot, but some towns are like, great, we got the award letter, let's go to construction, let's get this done. And that can be a big stepping stone mistake. Depending on the grant, there might be award conditions, there might be permits you need to acquire, you need historic preservation to sign off, you need to execute the grant, right? Depending on your grantor, it may take months for them to be able to generate a contract and then execute it with the town. And they always have it in the fine print, right? If you proceed before the grant is executed, you may not be reimbursed with the cost. So it's always good to kind of take it slow and coordinate with your program funder, whoever the contact is, and say, do I have the green light? Yes, I can. Fantastic. And so, some towns perhaps have pulled the trigger and, hired a contractor ahead of time to get a construction project done before the grant has been fully executed. And it's kind of like an oops, right? Especially with historic preservation. If there hasn't been historic preservation sign off or your permits, it can be a big tripping situation with the town. And so they kind of pause the town on kind of any movement. So we try not to, have the town to kind of just take it easy and kind of proceed until you have the green light kind of verified. Some of the funding realities, right? As we mentioned, depending on the grants using state funds are definitely more straightforward. They have perhaps less reporting requirements than the federal ones. Federal ones are, many of the towns have dealt with federal grants, perhaps through FEMA. They kind of understand there's a lot more strings and time commitments that will be involved. So, you know, there's also the town match levels. Kind of in general, town match is probably 80%, 20%. Um, FEMA is 75%, 25%. Um, and so, we have to make sure that the town is ready once the grant is awarded for that cash flow piece when it's ready for construction. Pretty much all the grants are reimbursement based. So the towns do have to upfront a lot of the costs first before they get reimbursed. Also, um, the town is typically the fiscal agent. Um, Most of the grants, even though we may work with them, it doesn't really flow through us. So the town is the fiscal agent. The town treasurer will be your very important person and help you with a lot of that financial aspect of the grants. So we talk about town reimbursements, right? And it may not be, you're like, yeah, 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 we understand. Yeah, we'll get reimbursed. But I think that's an important aspect to kind of consider with the process, depending on the grant tour. Usually, invoices are sent and approved to towns. Treasurers will need to put it into the town warrants for select board's approval. You may need to consider the timing because the contractor invoices, usually they have to pay their subcontractors within 30 days. So there is a clock that is ticking. Um, and you know, I'd like to talk about like one particular grant we had with the town of Hancock, tiny Hancock, right? And they were building a bridge and the contractor issued their invoice, and because it's a big bridge, the invoice was pretty significant, a couple $100,000 uh, for a tiny town like Hancock to kind of pass through. Um, they had to time it because perhaps their select board only meets once a month or twice a month. But if the invoice comes right after they have a town meeting, they have to wait another 2 weeks. That can be very challenging for the contractor if they have to wait another 2 weeks. So with Hancock, we were trying to time it for the submission so it would be very efficient for the town to get on the warrant and pay it so that the turnaround time for the contractor could be paid in a timely fashion. Um, as well, a couple $100,000 for any town can be a significant cost. And so, you know, there's also that reimbursement to the grant funders for the reimbursement piece. So sometimes, or most of the time, they would need a proof of payment to submit with the reimbursement. Um, and then you have to kind of consider the the time that it'll take for that grant agency for them to process and then turn around back to the town. So going back to the Hancock example, uh, it was a CDBG grant, and at the VCDP division, they process like every 2 weeks for requisition, but it had to be requisitions had to be submitted like on a Thursday before this certain date. And if we missed it, we had to wait another 2 weeks. So that example is probably a very extreme um, example of, reimbursement timings. Um, but it can cause a lot of angst and anxiety for the contractor as well as the town to do this. So this is something town should also be aware of for that cash flow process. I wanted to throw this in there because project management, many of us who have done project management can kind of laugh. Um, you know, we think, yep, we're going to manage a project from start to finish and it's going to be like this. But actually it's exactly like the figure on the right where there's a lot of back and forth and it's a maze but eventually we all kind of get there and the project team, whoever gets together, wants to help the town move in that direction. So we talk about some grant stumbling blocks. Towns will remain nameless, but from previous years, we've kind of seen some of these examples that have kind of either delayed or kind of tripped up towns that were managing grants. Um, so especially now, that first item, there are or can be a lot of town staff turnover and select board turnover. And so, it is really important for these grants to have some sort of continuity. And if there's brand new staff and brand new boards and nobody knows what grants you have, where they're at in the grant process, has anybody done reimbursement, any of that, it kind of, hurt the town because, they may not know where things are at. Um, Projects can take a while. And so sometimes the select board during the original grant application that may have been supportive of the project, um, may have changed by the time the project is in like full design mode, um, or close to construction, and perhaps there is a new changeover in the board. The new board may not be supportive of it. That may impact the project, despite prior investment and support. This also leads to the fact that, the project may be 80% or fully designed, and the board turnover kind of results in, well, we don't really like that. Let's go and redesign it. And perhaps in the engineering contract, that may not have been incorporated into their budget. And so they're like, okay, well, if you want us to redesign this, we're going to have to ask for contract amendment because we only, in our proposal, we've only allocated this much for sort of round one of design and not kind of redesigning again and again. Another piece that I just kind of thought of too, going out for procurement, whether it's a design engineer or a contractor, we get proposals, and perhaps those proposals are rejected due to various reasons, and the project needs to go back out to, bid. And so the delay in that initial process could add some costs to the overall project. As we know, project costs will increase over time just due to natural inflation. And so it's important for within the budget to have that contingency. In our budget, we incorporated 15 to 20% contingency, and that hopefully will help with kind of any unforeseen circumstances. I would like to point out, this is kind of a funny point, but residents and trees have completely stopped projects, believe it or not. And sometimes it can be frustrating, even if there are design solutions kind of around it, that would necessarily solve the solution, but there, you will always have residents that may not be supportive of the project, um, and that's okay. But sometimes they sometimes they stop the project after it's been fully designed and the town has invested a lot of time and money in it. Um, and perhaps a new board um, agrees with the resident and you kind of backtrack a lot. Um, and then finally, towns who have been awarded grants in the past have also returned grants. Perhaps they're like, oh, we kind of changed our mind, or for various reasons. Um, but it can be frustrating to all who have been involved with the project, um, depending how far the project has moved forward. If you've already procured a design engineer and, the town suddenly decides that they don't want to do it anymore, and then, you know, you've already spent the design engineering money. Maybe the town has to pay back some of the engineering money that you've already been reimbursed. Um, so it can be kind of frustrating um, in that respect. So Two Rivers as a resource, we hear a lot from towns that they just don't have the staff capacity to write grants. And we understand that. Um, so depending on what type of grant the town might be interested in, our staff is fairly familiar with whatever different requirements. We can help either write or review the application, um, kind of look at it to see how ready it might be, as well as the eligibility. And then also depending on the grant, um, the grant writing may already be part of the town's municipal dues. So um, I would say just kind of give us a call to see what you might be interested in. And as always, give us some time, give us a heads up. Like we understand that this grant application or program is open and that we want to apply for it and we need some help. Um, you know, just give us some time. So if we can allocate enough time to kind of help the town with a particular application if needed. Grant administration. So we would have, if the towns got awarded a grant and it requires project management, and if the town would like our staff to help with being the project manager, we can take a look at our staffing capacity and it would be a separate contract with us for that project. But, obviously if it required project management, that cost would already be kind of written in um, to that project cost. Um, this would be very beneficial if towns are experiencing staffing turnover. So there's that project continuity to kind of help the town keep marching forward. And then obviously a key piece is your treasurer, when it comes time for um, especially construction, the invoicing, the cash flow will be extremely important at that aspect. Show me the money. All right. So this is just a snapshot of grants that are out there. Um, from the left, VTrans, those are kind of the typical ones that are always there. Same with ACCD. DEC has clean water grants. There's a lot of acronyms out here for those that are fairly new. Um, it's okay. We can help you navigate. And then as we kind of move from the screen from left to right, from VTrans to EDA, I would say, the frequency of those grants are reflected in that. So, most towns would have experience with some of these VTrans grants. Towns also have applied for ACCD grants, mostly municipal planning grants. a couple that are CDBGs, maybe the Downtown Transportation Fund. With the Clean Water Act, there's been an influx of clean water grants in the last few years with DEC. And then there's FEMA. Um, FEMA, whether it's after a declared disaster or these annual ones that are hazard mitigation grant plans or building resilient infrastructure communities. And then you have a new one, which is like the Northern Borders Regional Commission for an EDA. This is just a snapshot of it. And here is a complete listing of all of the grant resources. Our sister agency, Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission, they have developed a fairly detailed database of all the funding opportunities across all the different state agencies and things like that. I'm not going to go through them individually, but you can kind of scroll through them. Let's see, VTrans has a pretty good one that you can kind of take a look at. This one is all the VTrans grants that are available here. And if you have any questions, you can email the program manager, or you can always give me a shout as well. And then VLCT has a pretty hefty one as well. The Vermont Federal Funding Guidebook that has a lot of those federal infrastructure grants here. And yeah, those will be like on the slides. So I'm going to stop share. That's kind of it for what I have in terms of a snapshot. And we can open it up for Q&A, folks.
The first question that we have in the chat is, whose responsibility is it to renew the sam.gov account every year?
Yep. So just to kind of recap again, it kind of varies by town, perhaps depending on who actually originally set it up. It could be the town clerk, the treasurer, those are the folks who probably be responsible to renew it each year. The most important piece is like who has the original password. and who can find that password if there is staff turnover in the town.
Is sam.gov required for state and federal grants? I believe this is already answered in the chat, but good to talk about.
Yep. Definitely for federal grants. And I think Pete also put grants.gov and login.gov, which also kind of funnels you into sam.gov. Probably not so much for state grants that I'm aware of, but I think they all kind of internally track. And it's just in general good to make sure it's active and renewed each year. And it's pretty easy to just renew each year. You just kind of log in and you click a button and you should be all set. But usually for the different funding grantors, their contract administration will make sure, the town is registered, they're not on the debarment list, those things like that. So next. Let's see. Yes, the slide deck will be available after the presentation. And also I'll send a link to our YouTube channel as well. And yeah.
We've run out of questions in the chat, so if there are any other pressing questions.
No questions. Yeah, so for grants, I would say kind of figure out your town's priorities. You're not going to be able to tackle all of them at once. But I would say, you know, the transportation ones, I'm working with all of your town road foremen. They kind of know which annual ones they're going to tackle, kind of the low hanging fruit ones. Um, and then the bigger ones that, you know, require bigger construction efforts. Um, we can try to help you find a grant that might be able to match that. So yeah, just give us a call.